So I did a video the other day, and in that video I spoke about how loot feels broken on Sakhal, or at least how my interpretation of how the game currently plays in the state it's in feels unbalanced. Let's start with the other maps first. Right, so this is Chernarus. Now I don't know if you can actually see the coastline here, it's not the best image, but right, so the coastline goes along here. This is Chernarus, arguably the biggest map on DayZ, and as you can see there are tier zones. There's tier 1 which is green, tier 2 which is blue, and tier 3 which is yellow, with tier 4 zones scattered all around and throughout. If you look at tier 1, now keep in mind when people travel on Chernarus, everybody sort of has a goal to go to the northwest because they want to get to Northwest Airfield, and then eventually around here you want to go to Tizzy and everything else. No matter where you start along the coast, that is basically the progression you take. You always find a way to go there. If you're in Survetlo, you go down, follow the road, and you eventually get there. My thing with this is it's perfectly fine. You know, you look and you measure the zones. Tier 1, for example, that's the size of tier 1. The size of tier 2 is right here. It's perfectly fine. The smallest is tier 1. Realistically speaking, they want you on the coast, and then they want you to leave the coast as soon as possible. That's how Chernarus has always been made. It's what you've been encouraged to do. It offers you little, but enough to get to tier 2, which is where you can start getting better gear, better loot. Doesn't matter where you go, you can follow any of the numerous paths and it'll get you to where you need to go. Additionally, and one of the greatest things about this map, is there are also lots of little tier 2 and somewhat tier 3 areas, although mostly tier 2 areas scattered around, and this is in the form of the military crates you can find at the docks. Additionally, you can also go to the police stations. To the police stations scattered everywhere. It doesn't matter where you are, there's a police station somewhere, you'll always find one, plus lots of other guns in tier 1 quite early on, which can carry you all the way through to tier 3. So it's a good map, it's a well designed map, and there's lots of options in this tier 1. Although it is just tier 1, you will always find some good and some diverse loot. Now when you go to Livonia, and this is Livonia, you can see here Livonia, so the river sort of goes up here or whatever, doesn't it? And as soon as you cross the river, you're in tier 2. Now tier 1, although this is technically tier 1, all of it, this is really all that ever gets used on tier 1, isn't it? Like, this bit is never ever really used. However, what Livonia does, what Chernarus doesn't, is it gives you so much loot to begin with. All these cities that go around the place, all these cities are filled with loot, and then the idea is you stock up in tier 1 and then go to tier 3 and eventually you go down to the bunker, and that's usually what the progression goes, isn't it? Like, everybody goes and does the same thing. Now, similar to Chernarus, where you have the crates on the docks, the military containers, I mean, you have these little bunkers, and the bunkers are all over the place, and you can see that they lead to whatever else, which is obviously a much higher tier place, but a really high PvP area. So you have all these things scattered around, and you can sort of follow them for natural progression. If you also look at this map, you can see that if you follow the line here, go all the way around tier 1, and then you do the same for tier 3 all the way down here. So you have tier 1, tier 2, and then tier 3. You can see that they're pretty even, right? It's a very, very big map, and although all of this is tier 1, as I've said, it's more than likely this is actually tier 1 and nobody really uses any of this because there's not much point. There's a church, there's some places to go, it's fine. Everything you need are in these spots. You got, you know, Gleniska, Toplet, everywhere is around the place. So even when you stay in tier 1 here, there's a lot of variety. There's also lots of police stations and military checkpoints and everything else that sort of works there and fits. So it's a really good place to be at. Either way, all I'm saying is tier 1 is a very, very diverse place, and it doesn't matter where you are on the map, you can always get some good loot. Then we go to Sakhal. Now, there's a few things with this. First of all, Sakhal is much smaller than the other maps. You also have to keep that in mind as we go through this. It is much smaller, like a third of the size. And then you have tier 1. So I'm going to ignore the surrounding islands. I don't know why they're such a low tier. My only guess is because they're not complete yet. So you have here, obviously the exception of here, which is, I think, not the prison camp. There's like a little mine, I think it's there. This is tier 1. And then again, tier 2, all the way around. Like I say, about to make my main point. Following tier 3, right? Now, if you look at the sizes, they're somewhat even, with tier 3 being the smallest, and then obviously tier 4 would be the shipwreck. So you have tier 3 here, which is tiny compared to tier 2 and tier 1. Tier 3, very good loot, is not really obtainable anywhere near the start. With Sakhal, that's not the case. But the problem here with Sakhal is when you spawn, wherever you spawn along the coast, which is here, you are stuck in a weird purgatory state, because if you spawn up here, which let's face it, lots of people spawn up here, you then have to do the monotonous task of going through every single coastal town. Now you can, if you spawn here, go over here to the base and you can get some loot. But then if you were to go all the way through here just to get to tier 3, it's not going to be the most fun way to travel, and you're probably not going to run into anyone. Plus, it's not the greatest for progression, because although tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 are there, the way the loot is distributed in them feels different to the other maps. There are no real police stations. There are police stations, but not really. They're quite rare. It's a small island, they don't have them. It makes sense. But from a progressional point of view, finding guns itself is not difficult. It's very easy to find a gun, but you will just find a million different types of the same gun. Like, it's always a BK-18. And because you have to go along the coast just to survive, it also slows everything down, which means you're in this sort of weird purgatorial state, because even when you get to these tiers here, they're not really great. Now, this is technically tier 3, this city. However, tier 3 is more down here, let's face it. You know, the military sites along here. In the city, although it's tier 3, you're not going to find the best of weapons. So even when you do get geared, you sort of feel like you're not quite right. Like, the amount of time you spend on this map, despite it being smaller, you get geared at a much slower rate than if you were to go to Chernarus or even Livonia. And that just shouldn't be the case. And that's the issue I kind of had with it. So for me, if I was them, I'd change a few things. They need to add more dynamic events. They need to add more things such as police stations, because they did have police cars there, but they don't really give you the variety of loot that a full police station does. And the other points just feel way too limited. And even if you started here and you wanted to go to the tier 2 zone, you're still not getting the same opportunities as the other maps. And then you're going into tier 2, which is almost the equivalent of tier 1 in the other maps. So it's just not fun. It feels as though it sort of slows you down and you're sort of suffering as a result. And the fact that they've made all the tier zones sort of equal in size, despite the fact that this map is actually much smaller, just isn't really that fun. I don't know what the point in that was. Realistically speaking, if it was me, I would have changed the tier zone to be tier 1 more along here, like this. And this would be my tier 1. I go all the way around here, and then all of this would be tier 2. Well, actually, tier 2 would be up here, tier 2 around here, tier 2, and then I'd have tier 3 all here, apart from there, and I'd have this as tier 4, and obviously the bunker would be tier 4, which it is anyway, and I'd also have the island here would be tier 4, right? So that's how I'd be changing it, and I'd be changing this island to maybe a tier 2 and another tier 2, and then you can sort of see this would be a tier 2 as well, because it's difficult getting there. The other islands tier 2s, and that's how I'd sort of change it to make it better, because then at least it's a little bit of a cross into somewhere, because as I've said, there's not really much point going here other than the fact that it looks pretty. There's not much choice to go there. There's not much reason to go there if you want to gear up, and unfortunately in DayZ, if you're playing official especially, you do need to gear up, because if you don't, other players will. Hey, where is the airport? The airport's somewhere here, isn't it? So I'd also have the airport. Yeah, the airport will probably be tier 4 as well, just because screw it, why not? But I think that's a much more balanced version. You have, similar to Chernarus, see the way it's really thin, larger, and then the largest there. But with Sakhal, you'd have thin, the larger, which is on the inside, because obviously loot is more scarce. It's more difficult to get, so you can have a much larger tier 2 zone, and then I'd have tier 3 here with the tier 4. That's how I do it, and I think that's a much better way to balance the map. I don't think the way they've done it right now works, because there's just too much tier 1, and tier 1 wouldn't be a problem if we had the same options that we have on the other maps, or at least that the loot dispersion itself and how the loot has been approached and added to the game was much better constructed, but it's not right now. And it also solves one of the biggest problems with Sakhal, which is where exactly is the point you're supposed to be going to, because the peninsula is quite a long way. It's quite a big piece of land, so it's like, where do you go? And because they've changed the ice sheet so you can sort of better access the peninsula, chiller right now, you sort of need an endpoint. Now, in my opinion, if you start in the top right, which is generally how it goes, then you should have to go to the bottom left. This progress is what keeps the other maps going. It adds a flow to it. For example, you have Livonia where you start off here and then your goal is to sort of go this way and then to the bunker there, which was a more recent inclusion that worked really well and improved the map overall. And then you have Chernarus. Everybody knows Chernarus. You start here and then you eventually go to Northwest Airfield and then you go around here. So this way all three maps have a flow and everybody has that point. Anyway, I'm sorry if that went on for too long. Please let me know what you think, and as always, until next time.